Welcome to the LowCarbUSA podcast, where we seek to inspire you to help us build this community. I'm Doug Reynolds.
And this is Pam Devine.
So Janae, welcome. I actually found out from Pam that you're on Instagram as Carb Addiction Mom. And I'm being aware of the fact that you're pregnant now. We really thought it would be a good idea to talk about your journey through your pregnancy as a keto mom. Just by the way, I have Janae Cywes here with me, and I was going to say that she's Dr. Rob Cywes' sidekick, but I think it's actually I'd phrase it the other way. That Dr. Rob Cywes is your sidekick, right?
It's my sidekick.
I know Pam has a lot of interest in what you've been doing and how it's been going and your experiences in that. So I think I'm going to let her just take it away.
Yeah, we were very excited to learn that you were pregnant, and
Thank you.
Figuring out. I mean, I don't think it's a secret that it was unexpected, really, and we can always cut that out if it is. Not. But
no, it was a surprise.
Yeah, and so you've been eating a low-carb ketogenic diet all along, and mostly carnivore. If I go by what Rob's always, talking about eating, so you probably eat similar things. I was interested to know, and you can let our audience know as well, if you add things in because you need to, feel like you need to or not, and see how we're feeding and growing this little one who's due third week in August 2020.
Yes. Well, thank you, first of all, Pam and Doug, for having me today. I really appreciate it. I do think it's a topic of interest to a lot of people, maybe not everyone, but certainly we're more than willing to share our journey and, talk about what we do. As my husband has no shortage of things to talk about. So
that's a true statement. Yeah.
If anybody hasn't, we can make a quick note. Carb Addiction Doc and LowCarbUSA, Doug and Rob Cywes have very extensive interviews on our video section, and it has a lot of information. It's called Diabetes Understood. It's a 13-part series, and Doug would always say, Rob, let's keep it to 45 minutes, and many of them are an hour and a half. And we've had notices on there that said, it's a good podcast or video interview if you immediately start listening to it again
after an hour and a
half. And it just jam-packed with information. So anybody who wants to go back and look for Diabetes Understood under our resources and videos section. But we'll just continue to talk to our good friend Janae a little bit more about what her journey in pregnancy and for women for low carb and keto.
Sure. So you're right, Pam. So we eat mostly carnivore when we're not pregnant. So I'll just start, or when I'm not pregnant anyway. And actually that, and we've done a couple other interviews on Rob's YouTube channel and a couple other places about, our journey. So some of this may be a little repetitive for folks who have listened to those. But what I was going to tell you is we actually started going more on the carnivore side of things a little bit prior to Low Carb San Diego last year. So it was probably about, I'm going to say the spring, maybe even just kind of right after your Palm Beach conference last winter. And there was more and more talk about it, momentum about it. And Rob had kind of always said, no, he really wanted to keep veggies in. And then after meeting with, a lot of the Ken Berries, the Sean Bakers, et cetera, we decided let's give it a try. And I never really had an interest in vegetables anyway. So that's really when we went more carnivore. And I actually tell folks in some of the other interviews that I've done is really about the time. I mean, we were sort of being intentional about trying to have a baby once we actually got to the point that we decided it would be okay. And really it was more for Rob to decide than me, because he obviously is at a different stage of life than I'm at, where he had children before and he was a little bit older than me. So it took some time to kind of come to reconcile that. And once we got on the same page about being more intentional about trying, we tried for a while with no success. And so what I tell people is the time that we really went carnivore is where I started to get kind of like really, really regular with my cycles, and things became much more predictable. And then ultimately that's when we ended up finding out about 9 months after I was carnivore is when we ended up getting pregnant. So I think it actually had a huge impactful difference in our journey along the way. So I think, it's important for people to know. I mean, it still took 9 months. Again, we had crazy schedules, travel, everything else, life happens. But I think from just a body standpoint, a metabolism standpoint, the carnivore diet really started to help regulate things routinely. And then when we did find out we were pregnant, I actually kind of went more back toward the keto side of things. So especially early on, about week 6 through 16, I had some aversions to red meat, which is very unfortunate because we eat steak probably like you guys do all the time. And so that was a little bit tough, just having absolutely, I mean, if I looked at it, it would just turn my stomach. So I really wasn't able to do red meat for about 10 weeks. And that's when I started kind of back toward more of the keto side of things. So I was doing more veg. I would have, sometimes dinner would just be a salad. But that's what I could tolerate at the time. That's what I did. So I've been pretty keto throughout the pregnancy. There's definitely been days where I'm completely carnivore, but I pretty often will have tomatoes, avocados with my meals, or even a small salad or something like that. So I do incorporate some veggies in as well.
Yeah, I know. And there are different people out there who may recommend a little bit more carbs for pregnant women. And so that's what I thought was interesting to find out how you felt about it. There are a few, people who will say maybe even, add in some sweet potato kind of things, a little bit more of the higher carb fruits and vegetables. And some people may not need it. I know you were talking about the conversation with carnivore, and I'll bet you that it was when Rob came out to Seattle, because that's when we had Sean Baker and Ken Berry and a few other real carnivore conversations in May of last year, 2019. But Ken's wife, Nisha, was pregnant at the time. And I remember him doing a thing where she had a deep aversion to eggs. And, similar to what you had with red meat, that, in her early months of pregnancy, and she usually loved eggs. So we were talking about different ways that she might be able to have eggs, like especially poached eggs. And I have found a way, because this one has a deep aversion to eggs all the time. So, and anybody,
I'm not pregnant.
and he's not pregnant. Anybody who knows personally or has heard us talk about this many times, I've always had to find creative ways to cook eggs in our house. So I talked to Ken about something that I had been doing, cooking them in bone broth. So I got the real good nutrients from the homemade bone broth that I made. And I also had nice good electrolytes, and then the eggs poached in the microwave in the bone broth. So we had been talking about that, which is really interesting.
Yeah. And I know it was leading up to Seattle last year, because by the time we got to Seattle, we were fully carnivore. That's why I was saying, I think it was last spring sometime we kind of made the decision. But by the time we were all at that conference together, we were fully carnivore. So
it was interesting because, Carb Addiction Doc talks a lot about the addiction and the difficulties that people have cutting out carbs from their diet. And I'd love to hear if you felt like you had that same carb addiction, whether or not you had more cravings for carbs or less. It doesn't sound like it while you were pregnant. And, to go back before, when you were converting over to a low carb ketogenic diet, did you feel like you had that addiction component of the switch or not?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So Rob and I actually always have philosophical discussions about this point, because he always says things are very binary, right? You're either an addict or you're not. And if you are either a type 2 diabetic or you're obese, you're an addict. And if you're healthy and you're not those things, then you're not an addict. So what I say to him is, I really feel like there's something in between that, where, because in my former life, I definitely abused carbs way more than I should, probably even was addicted to carbs. But I was once I understood the science and the damage that they were doing to my body, I was able to turn it off very easily. So I was really, and probably at that point in my life, I'm sure I was insulin resistant. So even though I fell into one of his categories of being unhealthy because of the carbs, once I figured it out, recognized it, I was able to turn it off like that. And so I'd be interested to hear both of your journeys as well, because they are addictive substances, but I do think there are people who, you know, are able to have 1 or 2 potato chips out of a bag or a few M&Ms out of a bag and put it away. And that was definitely the category I was in. You know, I would go out to dinner. I remember when I was in college, I would go out to dinner with my family. We'd go to the Olive Garden. I loved the Olive Garden. And now it just turns my stomach to think about the Olive Garden. But, and I would go through like 2 of those garlic breadstick baskets myself, you know, so, but I didn't know at the time, had no idea that how toxic bread was to my body and what it was really doing to me. Once I finally met Rob, and well, I was actually low carb before meeting Rob, but once I really understood the science behind it even more so, it was very easy for me to turn it off.
Yeah, I found that exactly the same. I mean, I being a runner and being told that I should eat as many carbs as possible, and that I was eating so much chocolate and ice cream and potato and pasta and all of that stuff. And when I first decided to pull the trigger and do this, I thought I would really struggle. And I found that there were so many things that I was allowed to eat now, that because we were allowed to reintroduce fat into the diet, things that I'd been banned from eating since I was 5, I could eat again now. And everything tasted so much better. And so I focused on, I mean, we went in all new recipes, like every night I got back in the kitchen, I chasing Pam out of the kitchen, which she couldn't believe. And, I started cooking stuff and really looking forward to the food. And I couldn't care less about the pasta and the rice and those bland things that I couldn't eat anymore. Because all the sauces that you put on those things that actually give it flavor, I was still allowed to eat, right? So I didn't struggle at all. And so when I started talking with other people about it and hearing people say, oh, it's so difficult, it's not sustainable and all of that stuff, I had no tolerance for that. I just said absolute rubbish. Either you're just not convinced that this is what you need to do. And even if you aren't half convinced, once you experience all the cool foods you can eat, it's easy. Right. And then I met Rob. And over listening to his talks and then getting through that huge amount of time that we spent together recording all those videos on YouTube, I started to learn and had to become aware of the fact that carb addiction was a very serious thing that I realized now I didn't have, because Correct. I literally flicked a switch and I never pined for that stuff again, ever, to this day. And so I'm not addicted, or I wasn't addicted. But I do now understand that there are a lot of people, and probably the majority of people, that have an addiction to some extent. Some are really bad, like Rob, and others are not so. But they do have some kind of an addiction. It's just more difficult for them to say no, but it's not impossible. And I think that's why Rob is so articulate when he talks about this stuff, because he, like he said, he calls himself the fat guy. He struggles with it every day, like a severe alcoholic struggles with alcohol every day. And even, and he even falls off the wagon now and again. And we even did one of our talks was about exactly that, was falling off the wagon and what you do to get back on again. But I do have to agree with you that I disagree with him to some extent, that if you're sick, then define it. If you're insulin resistant, right, which can manifest itself in a number of different chronic situations, then I was insulin resistant, very insulin resistant by the time I pulled the trigger here. So therefore, and I've determined that I wasn't an addict. So that's where I agree with you, is that there's no way that if you're sick, you have to be an addict.
Right.
And that so when we're trying to teach people, we need to address those people as well, people like me, who don't need to be treated like addicts. And I think the difficult part is trying to ascertain whether someone really is an addict or whether they just literally don't have any commitment to doing that at all.
Right.
I think that, and that's an interesting point, and I don't know if Rob does this, but one of the last conferences that we had with Joe Nitzlin was there. She actually has a questionnaire, and she has been providing that to healthcare practitioners to even put in their waiting room. And then, it's got 10 things and criteria that say if you have 6 out of these, you're this much on the addiction scale. If you have 4 to 6, then you're, in the middle, and 1 to 3 to 4, you're here on the addiction scale. So in that model, and she may work with people differently on what spectrum of addiction you have. Now, to go back, when Doug first started listening to the science behind low carb, at first it was, what are ketones and that kind of thing. We were kind of introduced like with ketones, and we were like, what is this? And what's the low carb diet? And he had written out a list and said, we're going to the grocery store. And I always laugh because I say, you've made a list and you want to go to the grocery store with me? Because that didn't happen very often.
And you want to cook the food afterwards.
And now you're coming into the kitchen.
I know.
So, and I immediately was confused by the whole thing. Where are we going to get our nutrients? And I'm not going to have bananas for breakfast in the morning. I thought I was eating healthy, and I was dying by 10 o'clock in the morning because I was eating oatmeal or a low-fat granola bar, or maybe not even a low-fat granola bar, because a lot of them have a lot of weird added oils in them. But oatmeal, banana. Sometimes I was trying to add in some nuts and trying to play around with protein, but I definitely was not getting enough protein in the morning. And then I would have a coffee that was low-fat and probably still had a lot of sugar in it. I had gotten to the habit of adding hot chocolate or getting the mochas from Starbucks. And there's a whole bunch of sugars and maltodextrins and corn syrup solids that I cringe when I think about, when we were talking about that cringing when you think about what you used to eat. And I thought, on the most part, I was eating fairly healthy. And my splurge was a chocolate croissant from Starbucks. That was like my favorite treat, which is terrible. And even going back before that, when I would go to the grocery store, struggling with energy, ups and downs all the time. I would walk by, you always walk by the bakery first trying to get to anything. And now it actually really does turn my stomach being in the bakery. But I would go by the little donut thing that were already freshly made donuts. And I would literally eat a donut, chocolate Long John thing, while I was grocery shopping and thinking it was terrible. Energy boost. Like I was like, I need an energy boost.
I know.
We've all been there, right? We felt terrible before this. Our energy levels were up and down most of the time because our sugars up and down crashes. Terrible inflammation and mood swings. Not crazy mood swings, but just feeling no energy, and then maybe that little bit of a kick when I had carbs. So that was a little bit pre even thinking about. And then once we did transition, I kind of went through a phase of, I'm going to finish up the stuff that's in the cupboard before I throw it away, the granola bars. And I don't know how long it took me. I'm pretty sure I stopped the oatmeal pretty quickly. And any of the grain-based type, muffins, cakes. And I was already trying to get away from those things because I was getting to be insulin resistant. I'd gone over the menopause stage fairly early and noticing that I was becoming a little bit funny, like food weirdness. It wasn't food addiction, but it was food confusion. Like I didn't know what to eat anymore. So I was cutting out breads, as much of white rices as I could. I was doing some brown rice, and we played around with quinoa. Doug thought quinoa was disgusting. I would like whip it into stuff, and there was like
but it's so healthy.
I know, it's so healthy, right? Did you ever try the whipped quinoa? It's supposed to be like a mashed potato type thing. It was like flakes. And Doug's like, what is this? And he's like, oh, it's not that bad. Or, and just trying to mix stuff like that in because I was putting on pounds that I hadn't before and I didn't know what to eat anymore. So I'm sure, and I wish that we would have had some lab tests at that time because I don't know what my A1C was at that time. I didn't know what my blood sugars were. We had like a blood panel done, fasting blood sugar and A1C for life insurance around, but I think we'd already transitioned a bit because my A1C, the last labs, any labs that I could find were 5.4, I think. And so I think I'd already transitioned over, but I thought it was going to be much harder than it was. I think there was still some times where we were still eating some things as well. Beans, I didn't realize, peanut butter, hummus, those kind of things that are healthy that you think are low carb, and watermelon. Remember we did that summer? We had done it in the summer and we had gotten watermelon. We're like, we didn't really know that watermelon wasn't a low carb fruit. It's not super, super depending on the how sweetness of it, how much sugar is content in it. But I think we did.
I think that's part of it, right? I mean, I think that the people who, once they understand, and just like you said, we didn't know watermelon. Now all of us, I mean, if you go to a Low Carb USA conference, which I highly encourage everyone does, and you hear somebody mention watermelon, the whole audience will gasp. So now we all know, but it's, everybody around us or many people around us still don't know. And that's part of the thing is, you always try because you want to spread the word and spread the knowledge of how much it's helped you, but you still have those people who just don't understand. And I think that people like us, maybe who aren't as much on the addictive side, but it's more of a wake-up call. And once we are educated, we can then, for this whole movement, we can really be loud voices in the crowd to help spread the knowledge, because we're the ones that it was the light bulb. Once we got it, and we want everybody else to know. Because you're right, Pam, I have people tell me all the time, or I'll see on even the low carb groups on Facebook or whatever it is, somebody will say, I'm pregnant, can I do keto in pregnancy? And people freak out. They're like, no, absolutely do not do keto in pregnancy, or, you better talk to your doctor. It hasn't been found to be safe. Even on my own Instagram, Carb Addiction Mom, I've had some comments about, there's no evidence that keto is good in pregnancy. And so it's really, really interesting that even—
I don't think there's any evidence that it's not either, though. And that's why I'm so keen to talk with you. And I mentioned last night when we set this talk up, that once things have settled down after our event and the birth, that we need to get back on again and talk about how the rest of the pregnancy went, how the birth went, and what you're now doing in support of Prof. Tim Noakes to raise a keto baby, right? Because that's how he ended up in court, because he basically told the lady who was asking about weaning her child off breast milk what was the best thing. And 3 years later, he only finally got out of court. But
exactly.
But now that's set a precedent, luckily. And so when other people talk about it, we can always refer back to that 3-year trial and all the evidence that he managed to get out there during that trial that showed that he knew what he was talking about.
Absolutely. And we'd be happy to share. I mean, we will shout it from the mountaintops about our journey and our, hopefully, it's success. We know it will be based on the science, but we want to be able to prove that to people, because that's what people want, is evidence. So we're more than happy to do a follow-up interview with you, Doug and Pam, and continue to show you the progress of our baby and the development of a child. So something we definitely want to share with the world.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, everybody continue to follow Carb Addiction Mom along her journey, and Carb Addiction Doc on his teachings. I know there are quite a few families out there who are online. They have books that other people can follow as well, learn a little bit more as we go through this journey. Maria Emmerich talks a lot about how she feeds her kids a keto low carb diet, and in her cookbooks. Somebody was just talking about a dietitian on my Instagram page was just talking about, there was a study on fasting and ketogenic diets that Jason Fung and Megan Ramos just published, and she was asking her colleague maybe or a friend about getting, must have been colleague, because she said we need to get more information and education for women, infant, and children, WICs, they call it. And somebody else was talking about, Lily Nichols has a book on diabetes and pregnancy, and then Megan came back and was talking about some more resources. I guess Tim Noakes has written a book for children in low carb ketogenic diets.
That's right. Yeah,
I hadn't.
about that.
Yeah. So, you know, that's out there, and there's lots of information out there about the safety, efficacy, and the vibrancy, and feeding your body healthy whole foods, nice amino acids from meats, and limiting your sugars and carbohydrates. We don't want our pregnant ladies to have gestational diabetes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
You know, they don't need to be eating a whole bunch of carbs and then trying to figure it out when they get diagnosed down the line. So as much as we can avoid that and future health risks, that and for the mom and the baby later on, right?
Yeah, what I was interested in, just going back to when you were talking about when you first got pregnant, was almost like the morning sickness phase, right? And you said you developed an aversion to red meat, which was pretty sad. But what you were eating in the meantime was like a salad and stuff like that. You weren't like scarfing down carbs then.
It's very important, and I would be remiss if I didn't talk about this because, you know, it's very important to Rob as well, is the saturated fat. So the fat is still such an important part. And I did not have an aversion to all meats. It was just red meat. So I was still eating chicken, fish, pork, you know, all of that, turkey. So I was still getting a lot of protein. And then the fat is the really important part. So we've always tried to, and in fact, I was already supplementing with a fish oil. You know, I have been for a while actually prior to us ever being pregnant. So that piece was really important as well. So we have to, everybody can never forget how important the fat piece is of it. We know there's such a developmental advantage that babies really need that. I mean, in utero and then once they're born as well.
No, Rob's always very, he's always at pains to point that out because so many people talk about carbohydrate reduction. But the whole thing is LCHF, right? High fat or healthy fats, as Gary Fedke likes to talk about it. And that is a very important component. We're not talking about calorie restriction or calorie reduction here. It's almost like a replacement. So you're cutting out all the carbs and you're replacing it with healthy saturated fat or healthy fats, including saturated fats. And that's very important for people to understand. And Rob always chips in with a reminder about that when people are talking about cutting carbs.
And especially if you're looking at getting pregnant or wanting to get pregnant or trying, it's important to, because, you know, like I said, we were fairly surprised because we had been trying for a while and nothing happened. So we kind of thought maybe the ship had sailed. And then when we found out we were pregnant, it was a surprise to us. But because we had, you know, been doing like a lot of saturated fat, you know, healthy fats in our diet, and then also supplementation with fish oil, we, even when we didn't know we were pregnant in the first few critical weeks of a child's life, there's so much development happening with the fetus at that point. And so when we did find out we were pregnant and we're surprised, we felt good about the fact that we had a lot of fat on board at that point, so that, you know, the baby had what he needed to make sure the proper development was happening.
Yeah, so he's going to stand out from the crowd once he's born and he gets older, right?
Yeah,
let's hope so.
Yeah, I thought, and that goes back to some of the videos that we've recorded with Rob and some of his presentations that he's done, talking about brain development, especially, and the neurological system are very dependent on fats for development. And he talks a lot about the rise of autism in children could be because of the low fat diet, and babies in development and children are not getting enough fat for the brain development. And it's a fascinating topic that doesn't get talked about and highlighted enough. There's a lot of conversations about different things, and I don't think that's understood enough, studied enough about the importance of fats in the development of a healthy brain and nervous system.
Yeah, I tell you what, that was, like I said, we ended up doing 13 episodes of those long-winded discussions that we had. But the one that he did was called ADHD, Autism, and Keto for Kids. That was the title we gave to it in the end. And I got told to shut up and not interrupt him by the watchers after the first couple of episodes already. So I just used to sit and listen to him talk and make notes and kind of ask some questions at the end. But normally he would stop and finish, and I would just look down and start asking him the questions. And when he got to the end of that one, there's like this uncomfortable silence. I was literally speechless. And at the end,
tears in your eyes.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, I just, all I could say was like, "Wow, Rob," you know. And so, I really encourage people to, you know, the people that are going to be interested in listening to this are hopefully interested in, or they're about to have kids, or they have young kids. Honesty, such a good talk to listen to, and very, very powerful.
And I will tell you, literally as we speak, Rob is in his office writing a book, a chapter for the book on autism. So, so I will tell you, so stay tuned for that, because there's a lot, I think, more information out there that we don't even know yet. And it's a very important topic, because the incidence of autism has grown exponentially. And that doesn't just happen, you know, over generations for no reason. So we have to look at what we've done in our society, what we've consumed, and where is that coming from. So I think, it's a very, very important topic.
Yeah, so good. I'm so glad to hear that maybe he felt bad. That's why he's gone and done some work on it. But because it's been a while since we did those talks, and we kind of mentioned once or twice that we were going to turn all of that content into probably at least two different books. But he's got more famous and more busy since then, and it's become harder and harder for him to get this stuff finished. So I'm really glad to hear he's working on it. I can't wait to finish working on that with him and get that thing out. It's going to be awesome.
Absolutely.
It really needs to get out there. You're talking about what else is on the rise, and diabetes is crazy on the rise in our global communities. And it's just, people keep talking about how it's genetic. How could it possibly change, our genetics change over a generation or two? Because there was no diabetes, type 2 diabetes, when, you know, earlier than an adult in their 70s and 80s, you know, later in life. And now kids are getting it, teenagers are getting it, kids in their 20s are getting it. And so let's look again at what are we consuming? What are the recommendations in our dietary guidelines? What is being fed in our hospitals, in our schools, in our military? Because our military guys are health checking out of the military. Unfortunately, their health is deteriorating just as much as the rest of the community's health. And we've got to keep our community strong and healthy, and with healthy blood sugars and metabolic health. So
absolutely,
all of this is so important as we're growing. And
if you guys will let me for a minute, I have to go back, because I would be remiss in not talking about this as well, because everybody who knows my husband, Rob, the Carb Addiction Doc, knows he talks a lot about the addiction piece, and we mentioned it briefly, but I just want to go back because, you know, the three of us kind of said, well, we think we're part of the category that, you know, maybe we weren't the addicts, but we were definitely abusers of carbs. And then once we knew, and we were able to turn it off. But, and so to take that one step further, because Rob is really big on the psychology behind it. You know, he and I have had a lot of talks about this through the years, and I'm sure lots of people have heard some of his lectures on this, but it comes down to how you were raised as a child and different parenting styles. And there's the permissive parents, the authoritarian, and the authoritative. And, you know, depending on how you were raised is typically how you end up, you know, growing up and struggling with addiction or not. And then that's usually how you end up raising your kids. So I will say that Rob always tells me the reason that I'm not an addict, or maybe I was an abuser, and once I knew I was able to turn it off very readily is because I had a very authoritative family, which is a very nice way, it's the proper way to really raise a family. So just from the psychological side of it, those are the families that have, fairly tight boundaries, but within those boundaries, they allow the children to have choices, and they're very supportive families. So I have to just say that, and Rob will attest to this because he knows my family very well, obviously, but I have probably the most amazing parents that you could ever hope for as a human being. And I'm so thankful and so blessed. And I thank God every day for that. But I have two wonderful parents. My father was a school superintendent. My mother was a teacher. So very education focused, grew up in a very educational household. But they were just the most supportive and loving family environment that I could have ever hoped for. And, Rob will talk about being raised in an authoritarian background is where your parents will set very high expectations for you. And if you don't quite meet that expectation, the distance between the expectation and what you actually achieved is considered failure. And it leads to a very poor sense of self. And those are the people that start to struggle with the addiction part of things. But if you're raised by a very authoritative family, they want you to do well, but they recognize the effort that you put in, and the effort that you put in is always rewarded. And so that was the family that I grew up in to a T. I mean, that describes how I lived, exactly. My parents were the most supportive, always telling us congratulations. We did well in school. We were good students. We were good athletes. We were involved in lots of activities, but we were never told that we didn't achieve enough. We were always given praise for what we did, the effort that we put in.
That's crazy,
That's interesting.
Yeah, because I think Pam was probably going to say the same thing, is that my parents are exactly like that too. And, I had very strict boundaries when I was a child, but I still had space to maneuver, right? I still had space to be creative and space to think for myself and to challenge things. And if I didn't agree with something, it was okay to at least ask why and discuss it, But at the end of the day, I had boundaries. And I think, now that you're bringing this up and the psychology behind it, it kind of makes sense that I had exactly the same response as you. Like I was totally abusing carbs and sugar before I flicked the switch, but had absolutely no issue turning it off when I decided that's what needed to happen. So that's cool.
That's actually really interesting because I hadn't thought about it that way. And I have to be honest, I'm not exactly like that. I actually have one of each. And a little combination of all of it. I think my father is more of the high expectations that don't get reached very easily. And my mom is the very
more permissive one.
Permissive and authoritarian. So she's conservative, agreeing, would give praise easily and does, but also very permissive because we had ding dongs and cupcakes and donuts and cakes. And that's one thing I didn't talk about is how I grew up. The sweet, crap, all the cereals and Danishes. And we went after church, we went to get donuts. And after the dentist, we went to the soda shop. I think, how is that even possible? But, there was they made these little tiny sodas in all different flavors and they came in this giant plastic case and you used to pick how many of each different flavors that you wanted in this giant case. And so we were drinking those sodas and Pepsi. And when I think about the amount of sugar that I consumed as a child and a teenager and a young adult, it's no wonder that I had, roller coaster mood swings. And let's talk about emotional buoyancy for a minute, because that's something Rob talks about a lot. And I don't think I had a lot of that. And this one has taught me a lot in the last 10, 11 years, whatever it's been now. We've lived together for 10. About emotional buoyancy and not going into the emotional side of something without either addressing it or not avoiding it, but like Rob says, doing things that make you feel better about yourself and not going down that hole of emotional upset and self-doubt and what's the word? Not annihilation, but when you're down, really get down on yourself. He's taught me so much about not being emotional about something and I don't really remember going to food in that instance, but maybe some, and maybe, alcohol and wine and stuff like that, where we all need to learn how to do that differently, especially, at this time of stress during the pandemic. We can't do the things we want to do. We have to internalize so much of it and be able to reward ourselves with things that we like to do. And he talks about art and that not doing artwork for it to be perfect and beautiful, but doing art as a creative outlet, right?
That's right.
So, and
so what is it that you guys do? Is there something that you do as a couple that you find emotional buoyancy?
What's so funny? We were talking about this on your Instagram page, and it's some things that we used to do that we haven't had a chance to get back to. We got busy. Our timing got a little bit weird, and it was an evening class. What we used to do martial arts, and we literally would box other people and each other and kickbox each other, and that was so fun. But we work together. We play together, we work out together, we do just most everything together. Even when we were getting to know each other long distance, I remember one time we were watching movies together and talking about it, and he would play his guitar and just listen, those kind of things that you do together.
Yeah, I mean, I was working in India.
Oh, wow.
Pam would tell me what she had on her on-demand or DVR or whatever. And I would go down to the flea market and go to the pirate, it was still VHS in those days. Right? I'd go down to the pirate video shop and get, find those titles, get pirate videos and come back to the hotel. And I had a conference bridge that I used for I was talking with people all over the world during the project. But on the weekends and at night, I just used to call Pam and then lock the bridge, and then we would just say, okay, go, and we'd both press start at the same time, on literally the opposite. It was 12 hours apart, opposite sides of the world, and,
so cool.
And then the bridge would be on, and we would sit and kind of chat. In fact, we didn't even say much because we were chat was a new thing in those days, and so we would actually just type to each other and chat while the movie was going on. And so that's how we became. I mean, we weren't really even going out at that stage. We became awesome friends just through that time, and it was the communication that that was so special. I think
the friendship is so much of that emotional buoyancy, the friendship and the support of each other more than...
As you know, one of the 4 things is human connection. And to me, that's the biggest one. That's always been, ever since I was a little kid, I just loved being around other people and hearing other people's stories. And as an adult, that's obviously continued for me. I could sit and talk with people for hours. So human connection is one of the 4 things that Rob talks about, spirituality, physical activity, human connection, and I'm not going to blank on the 4th one.
Got to be that creative
art. Yeah, creative arts. Yeah, because I don't really have much of that. I like to do it, but I'm not that great.
I'm not very good at it either, and it's one of the things that I have on the forefront of my mind to kind of try to start have that creative outlet and start doing it at some points. But to go back to, that's something that we do. That we had transitioned, that we weren't doing the martial arts as much because we started doing Ben's workout, Dr. Ben Bakikio's smart training. And we 2 days a week, now that the gyms are closed, we have been doing them at home, but 2 days a week we were going, and it would take, a couple hours, get ready, get to the gym, get to do we do 15 minutes each. So this is something that we have been able to do together. He does his weight, which is much more than me. I mean, you were doing the leg press at almost the second to last weight on the machine. And there's only one weight left. I was like, what are you going to do when you get to that one? And then I would be way at the top when I first started because I had hurt my knee and I had some atrophy in my quad. So mine was much less. And I actually was able to ramp that up pretty quickly. So he was very encouraging. he's my little coach, saying, like Ben always does, come on, you could do it. Do that one last one, do it. So, and then he would do his, and it takes us about 27 minutes to do our 15 minutes of fitness, because I do it and then he does it. So, during the stay at home, during this crazy pandemic, we found places in our house that we could put things in the door and continue to make sure that we have our physical strength and our emotional strength by keeping our muscles strong, having that outlet, I would go for a walk and he might go for a run, but that's not something we could do together because he runs much faster than me.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's something that maybe we need to get Rob to chime in about at some point, because because of this time, we talked about human connection, right? And it's all very well if you've got a wonderful partner that you're connected with, and that we used to basically living in each other's pockets. So,
Right.
so there's no change for us. But that's not the case for most people, for a lot of people.
I've thought a lot about, because I lived a lot of years on my own by myself. And
me too.
We both were probably thinking, what would we be doing right now if it was just us on our own? And I worry about people who are in that situation.
That's what I'm saying. I think there are so many, this is going to hurt so many people, apart from financial and how many millions of people are going to lose their money, business and their livelihoods and all of that. And that's depressing enough. But I still think more dangerous than that is the lack of human interaction and the lack of communication.
Yeah. And kids,
that's
kids
going
in
to
that development stage. When we're talking about kids, I'm wondering what kids are not having, that interaction and that back and forth banter and the sharing and the how do you get over conflict, especially toddlers and preschool, kindergarten age, but even into elementary, junior high, that whole, how do they communicate and get over conflict?
And I even people that I considered, like amongst our friends, like we were at Brian Linsky's had his new practice launch the other day. And so we're all there, and there's a lot of people in that community that are pretty diehard keto people, low carb people, I would have thought. And in their droves, people are admitting that they've fallen off the wagon and they've eaten carbs again and stuff now because they're depressed and stressed about being at home and losing their jobs and stuff. And so it's that maybe we need to get another talk from Rob about, in this particular environment, what we can maybe do.
I agree.
To shore up those strategies, emotional management strategies that he talks about. But I think there's like a new twist to it now. Yeah. That that's a good idea. I need to get him on, do a recording about that.
And that's why I loved your answer, Doug, when I asked you what you two do for emotional buoyancy, and you started talking about playing the guitar and watching movies and communicating with human connection, all those things. It was so interesting to hear. You had just talked about how you were raised in this family and you had this diverse emotional toolkit, as Rob would call it. And you did a lot of different things, musics and human connection and asking why and being curious and learning. Those are all things that I'm sure you learned as a child, and now you look at your emotional toolkit and it's so diverse, but some people don't have that. And so it sounds like the three of us are pretty fortunate in that regard, but we are also very empathetic to those who don't have that, because we understand it's a real thing and the struggle for those people is real. So, and those are some of the things that Rob and I do as well. I mean, I think I've introduced more emotional management strategies to him since we have been together, and we have learned to enjoy new things together, like playing cribbage. And we love to watch football. We both loved that before we met. But I mean, there's just so many things, and FaceTiming with his family in South Africa, or FaceTiming my family in Colorado, or our friends that live in DC, or just there's so much in that regard that can be done. And even though it's a really, really tough virtual world right now, you're right. I think we should do maybe a talk on that and various things you can do. our best friends who live in DC were having virtual happy hours a couple times a week, and they were keeping this big list up on the closet door of all the people they had had. And so they have a monthly list of all the people that they've had a virtual happy hour with during the pandemic. So it was just a cute way, and they really enjoyed that and looked forward to them and put on the calendar and, you know, made sure they had their drinks ready when the time came and stuff. And that was another way to find emotional buoyancy in this time. So I think there are strategies out there, but you're right, it's so important during this really unprecedented time in our world.
I think that's a very cool way to finish this off with the hope that I can get him on quickly and do an additional talk that we can add to that list.
Yeah, and anybody who's listening to this, make sure that you're staying connected. You know, we have to do it online or by phone. It's not quite the same as in person, but you know, we feel uplifted when we know we're going to get to talk to Janae Cywes this afternoon on a podcast, and we're, you know, having meaningful discussions about what's positive in our life and where we've come from and what we can do to better our futures. And, you know, let's just encourage everyone to do that. Reach out to somebody that you think might be in a situation where they're lonely or need somebody to talk to, and they can talk about, you know, where they are in their health. How are they feeling today? What can they do better? What have they found that works well, right? Let's do that.
Okay. Janae, thank you so much for spending the time with us.
Thank you, Pam and Doug.
It's been awesome. We've missed you.
I miss you guys so much. Virtual hug.
I know. We're so sorry we're not going to get to see you in person.
It's become like one of Rob's interviews. It's like, we've kind of.
I know. I'm so sorry.
Don't be. I think it was really good. And I think, you know, the people that listen are going to get a lot out of it.
Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to an episode of the LowCarbUSA podcast. You can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/LowCarbUSA.